October 24, 1960, a secret test range in the deserts of Soviet Kazakhstan, a place so classified it did not appear on any map, and was deliberately named after a town 200 miles away to fool foreign eyes. On a concrete launch pad stands a rocket taller than a 10-story building, freshly fueled and gleaming under floodlights against the darkening sky. Around its base move more than 100 people, engineers in shirt sleeves, technicians clutching clipboards, senior officers in dress uniform who have come to witness a milestone. At the center of them, seated in a chair placed only a short distance from the fully fueled missile, is the Chief Marshal of Artillery, Mitrofan Nedolin, commander of the entire Soviet rocket force. He has refused to retreat to the safety of the bunker. He wants to be close. The launch has fallen behind schedule, and the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution is only 2 weeks away, and Moscow has made it clear that it wants a success to celebrate. The rocket is designated the R-16. It is filled with a propellant. The men who handle it have privately nicknamed the Devil's Venom. The fuel and the oxidizer ignite the instant they touch, with no spark required. The same chemistry that makes the missile deadly makes it treacherous on the ground. It is violently corrosive and acutely poisonous. Every safety rule ever written for this machine says you do not crowd around it while it is fueled. Tonight, under the pressure of the calendar, nearly every one of those rules is being ignored. Roughly half an hour before the intended launch, a technician resets an electrical control. Deep inside the rocket, a fault sends a command that should have been impossible at that moment. The engine of the upper stage fires, while the rocket is still standing on the pad, still fully loaded, with the marshal and his men gathered in the open all around it. The blast tears downward into the fuel below, and in a single instant, the machine becomes a fireball. The heat is extraordinary. The people nearest the rocket have no chance. Others are caught as burning propellant spreads across the pad. The flash is reported to have been visible from tens of miles away. The official death toll, admitted only decades later by a state commission, was 78. Some historians believe the true figure was higher still. The marshal himself was identified only by a decoration and a piece of his uniform that survived the flames. The Soviet government told the public, and even the victims' families, that Nedolin had died in an airplane crash. It would not admit what really happened for 29 years. But this is not, in the end, a story about a catastrophe. It is a story about a survivor, and about the machine he would spend the rest of his life building. Because one man who was meant to be standing at the foot of that rocket was not there when it exploded. A few minutes before the fire, the missile's chief designer had stepped away, behind cover, to smoke a cigarette. His name was Mikhail Yangel, and the weapon he would go on to create would become the most destructive single machine ever set on a launch pad anywhere in the world. It would grow so powerful that when Western intelligence finally grasped what it could do, they did not label it with a dull code word pulled from a dictionary. They named it after the devil himself. They called it Satan, and their analysts calculated that just one of them, aimed correctly, could reduce an area the size of a small American state to ruin. If the hidden machinery of the Cold War is the kind of history that grips you, the engineering, the secrecy, and the terrifying logic of two nations building the tools of their own extinction, then consider subscribing, because this channel takes these declassified programs apart piece by piece and shows you how they truly worked and why they still cast a shadow today. Now, to understand how a nation talks itself into building a weapon like this, we have to start with the fear that created the hunger for it. In 1960, the Soviet Union believed it was losing, not on any battlefield, but on the far more dangerous ledger of nuclear arithmetic. Only 3 years earlier, the Soviets had stunned the planet by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, riding a rocket that could in principle reach America. The message to Washington was deliberate and chilling. If we can lift a metal sphere into orbit, we can drop a warhead on a city. In the United States, it fed talk of a missile gap, a supposed vast Soviet lead in long-range weapons, and it became a club in American politics. But the Kremlin was guarding a secret. The gap was real, and it ran the other way. The Soviets were the ones who were behind. Nikita Khrushchev had been bluffing, waving his space triumphs in the air to disguise the fact that his actual deployable missile force was thin, clumsy, and slow to fire. He was a gambler betting heavily on a weak hand, and he understood that if the Americans ever called the bluff, the result could be fatal. The Soviet Union did not need a handful of showpiece rockets. It needed a genuine arsenal, quickly, and above all it needed missiles that could survive an enemy strike long enough to hit back. Beneath that strategic problem sat a chemical one. The very first Soviet intercontinental rocket, the celebrated R-7 that had launched Sputnik, ran on liquid oxygen. Liquid oxygen must be kept unbearably cold, and it boils away without pause, which means a rocket fueled with it cannot simply sit and wait. It has to be filled right before launch, a process that could take many hours. A missile that needs half a day of preparation before it can fly is not a weapon you can retaliate with after the enemy has already fired. It is a target waiting to be destroyed on the ground. This was the nightmare that shaped everything that followed. Whoever could build a missile that stayed always fueled, always ready, always only minutes from flight, would hold a decisive advantage. And the key was the fuel. Not cryogenic liquid oxygen, but storable propellants. Chemicals that could rest inside a sealed missile for months or years, buried in a silo, waiting for an order. That was the grim promise of the devil's venom. It was appallingly toxic, and it had just killed a marshal and dozens of his men, but it could be stored. And storage meant readiness, and readiness meant survival. Here is the paradox that this entire story turns on, so hold it in your mind as everything unfolds. The Soviet Union did not build the most powerful offensive weapon in human history out of confidence. It built it out of fear. It built it because its leaders were convinced they were the weaker side, the more exposed side, the ones more likely to be struck first. Every additional ton the missile could throw, every extra warhead, every gain in accuracy, was an answer to a single dread, the dread of being caught defenseless. And the cruelest twist of all is that the weapon they created to guarantee their survival became so uniquely, so unbearably dangerous that it undermined the very balance it was meant to protect. It ended up as the one weapon on Earth that both superpowers would eventually agree, on paper, had to be hunted down and dismantled. They reached for perfect safety. What they built was a machine that made everyone, themselves included, less safe. To create it, the Soviet leadership turned to the man who had walked away from the fire. Mikhail Yangel was not a Moscow insider. He had been born in 1911 in a poor Siberian village, the descendant of a political prisoner exiled by the Tsar, one of a dozen children in a family that could not read or write. He trained first as an aircraft engineer, then moved into rocketry, and in 1954 he was handed his own design bureau, far from the capital, in the Ukrainian city of Dnipropetrovsk. The bureau was eventually named Yuzhnoye, which simply means southern. There was a cold logic to placing it so far from Moscow. Soviet planners knew that a single enemy warhead landing on the capital could wipe out the whole rocket industry if it were all in one place, so they scattered it on purpose. The most dangerous weapons in the Soviet future would be conceived and manufactured in Ukraine, a fact that would echo strangely into our own century. Before we follow Yangel forward, it is worth pausing on what the fire left behind, because it shaped both the man and the program for years. The secrecy was absolute. The families of the dead were quietly instructed to repeat the official cover story rather than the truth. Khrushchev ordered an investigation and placed a rising political figure named Leonid Brezhnev at its head. The commission found that far too many people had been standing beside a fueled missile, yet it chose to punish no one. Brezhnev is said to have explained that decision with a cold and simple phrase, that the guilty had already been punished. When Khrushchev spoke with Yangel afterward, he is reported to have asked the designer a single haunting question: why he had remained alive when so many others had not. Yangel carried that night with him for the rest of his life. He would go on to build weapons of almost unimaginable destructive power, but he would do it as a man who had watched the ground itself turn to flame a few steps from where he stood. Yangel became the great believer in storable fuel. Where Sergei Korolev, the famous father of Sputnik, clung to his cleaner cryogenic rockets and dreamed of space, Yangel built weapons designed to sit in the ground and wait. His view was blunt and practical. A missile is not a scientific instrument. It is a loaded weapon, and a loaded weapon has to be ready to fire at any moment. This placed him at the heart of one of the most consequential rivalries of the century, a quiet and often bitter competition between rival design bureaus that shaped the whole Soviet arsenal. Three great chief designers circled the missile programs, and they had little love for one another. There was Korolev, the legend, obsessed with reaching space and reluctant to soil his hands with storable fuel weapons. There was Vladimir Chelomey, aggressive and politically connected, whose bureau fought for every contract with the ferocity of a man who understood that in the Soviet system, losing a program could mean losing everything. And there was Yangel, the outsider from Ukraine, the pragmatist, the one the military trusted most because he listened to what soldiers actually needed and delivered weapons that worked. There is an old joke from that era that captures the pecking order. Korolev works for glory, Chelomey works on nonsense, and Yangel works for us, the us being the men who would actually have to fight a war. It was not entirely a joke. That rivalry followed the heavy missile all the way to Satan. When Yangel's bureau proposed the new giant, a storm of opposition rose inside the Soviet establishment, and the loudest skeptic was Chelomey himself. He is said to have mocked the design, declaring that he would take off his hat if that rocket ever flew. The rocket flew. According to the engineers at Yuzhnoye, Chelomey conveniently forgot he had ever made the promise. The heavy missile line had begun with the doomed R-16, the missile that killed a marshal on the pad, and then matured into the first Soviet weapon that could genuinely counter the American Atlas and Titan rockets deployed by the hundreds. It advanced through the R-36, which Western intelligence tracked and christened the SS-9 Scarp, and it would reach its terrible peak in the machine the world learned to fear. The troubled birth of the R-16 did more than kill men on a pad. It rippled outward into the largest crisis of the entire Cold War, because the early Soviet long-range missiles were so few, so slow, and so unreliable. The Soviet Union entered the early 1960s genuinely outgunned in the weapons that could reach America. Khrushchev was unwilling to wait the years it would take to field a proper intercontinental force, so he reached for a cheaper and faster fix. He would place shorter-range missiles close to the United States instead, on the island of Cuba, where they could threaten American cities without needing to cross an ocean on their own. That gamble brought the world nearer to nuclear war than it has ever come, before or since. The same shortfall that drove Yangel to build his heavy giants also helped push two superpowers to the brink, over an island in the Caribbean. The hunger for a missile that could truly reach across the ocean was never an abstraction. It was the shadow standing behind the most dangerous 13 days in human history. Consider what the SS-9 already represented. It was a giant, a two-stage monster running on storable propellant, able to carry a single warhead of staggering size across the whole planet. Western analysts estimated its largest warhead at somewhere between 18 and 25 megatons. To make sense of that figure, remember that the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was roughly 15 kilotons. A 25 megaton warhead is not twice that, or 10 times that. It is well over 1,000 times the Hiroshima blast, delivered in a single flash of light. The SS-9 was built to threaten the American command centers that controlled the United States missile force, to blind and behead the enemy's ability to strike back. And it was only a stepping stone. Yangel's bureau was already imagining something far worse. Now watch the paradox begin to move, because this is the point where the weapon stops being a mere machine and starts bending world events around itself. As Yangel's missiles grew larger and more precise, a shift began in the calculations being run in Washington. For years, American strategists had reassured themselves with a comforting belief. Their own land-based missiles, the Minuteman force sitting in hardened concrete silos across the Great Plains, could ride out any surprise attack and still strike back. That belief was the foundation of the entire balance. It was what made a Soviet surprise attack pointless, because enough American missiles would always survive to guarantee a devastating reply. The heavy Soviet missiles threatened to erase that certainty. American silos were hardened to withstand enormous pressure from a nearby blast. But hardening only helps if the enemy warhead lands far enough away. Bring a large enough warhead close enough, and no amount of concrete matters. By the middle of the 1970s, American analysts were making a frightening argument in classified briefings. If Soviet accuracy kept improving and Soviet warheads kept multiplying, then a Soviet first strike might destroy the great majority of the Minuteman force before it ever left the ground. The retaliation that was supposed to be guaranteed would no longer be guaranteed at all. This fear acquired a name that would haunt American politics for a decade. They called it the window of vulnerability, and the missile at the very center of that fear was the successor Yangel's bureau was about to unleash. Yangel himself did not live to see it stand on alert. In his final year, he was gravely ill, worn down by a series of heart attacks. On October 25, 1971, he sat through a long meeting in a smoke-filled room and suffered a last fatal attack that night. By one reckoning of the old calendar, it was his 60th birthday. It was also, almost precisely, one day after the 11th anniversary of the fire on the pad that he had walked away from to smoke a cigarette. The man who had cheated the devil's venom died within a day of the anniversary of the night it nearly took him. His deputy, Vladimir Utkin, stepped into his place, and it was Utkin who carried Yangel's last and most fearsome design to completion. That design was designated the R-36M. To the men of NATO, it would become the SS-18, Satan. Now we arrive at the machine itself, and to understand why it terrified the world, you have to see how it worked, because its genius was not only its size. It was a chain of clever answers to problems that had no obvious solutions. Start with the most basic one. How do you fire a missile weighing more than 200 tons out of a silo without wrecking the silo and without cooking the missile in the blast of its own engines? The obvious method was the one everyone tried first. You ignite the engines inside the silo and let the missile climb out on a column of fire. This is called a hot launch, and it carries a heavy penalty. The exhaust is so violent that it ruins the silo. Firing one missile leaves that launch position useless until it can be rebuilt, and rebuilding a hardened silo takes time you would never have in a nuclear war. Yangel's bureau chose a harder path that offered a far greater reward. They chose the cold launch. Picture it. Inside the silo, the missile waits sealed in a launch canister. When the order comes, a charge at the bottom of the tube generates a sudden surge of gas pressure, and that pressure alone throws the entire 200-ton missile straight up and out of the silo, like an immense shell fired from a cannon. Only after the missile is clear of the ground, hanging in the air perhaps 20 or 30 meters up, do its own engines light. Because the silo acts like a giant mortar tube, this was sometimes called a mortar launch. Perfecting it was brutally difficult. The engineers had to guarantee that a fully fueled missile could be flung into the air by a gas charge and then reliably ignite its engines in the fraction of a second after leaving the tube, without tumbling, without falling back onto the launch site. But the payoff was enormous. The silo survived the launch, since the fire went into the open air rather than into the concrete, and a silo that survives can be reloaded and fired again. A cold-launched force was not a collection of single-shot weapons. It could, in principle, reload, and that made it far more menacing. Then there was the payload, and this is what turned a very large missile into a strategic earthquake. The SS-18 could be armed in two ways. In one form, it carried a single, colossal warhead, up to roughly 20, by some estimates 25, megatons. This was the version built to obliterate the hardest targets on Earth, the buried command bunkers and deep leadership complexes. It is also the version behind the claim in the title of this video, and it deserves an honest accounting rather than a wild exaggeration. A single warhead of that size, detonated over a city, would not vaporize a neat circle. The fireball alone would be miles across. The blast would flatten heavy buildings for several miles in every direction. But it is the heat that truly defines a weapon of this class. The thermal pulse from a detonation above 20 megatons can start fires and inflict fatal burns across an area of thousands of square kilometers, a zone comparable in size to a small American state, such as Rhode Island or Delaware. It could not erase Texas or California, but it could turn an entire major metropolitan region and everyone in it into a single burning ruin, from one missile in one flash. That is what it means to build a city killer. That is why the nickname endured. The second form was, in strategic terms, even more chilling. Instead of one giant warhead, the missile could carry a cluster of smaller ones, each capable of being steered toward a completely different target. The device that made this possible is sometimes called the bus. After the main rocket stages burn out and drop away, the payload section keeps flying, carrying its cluster of warheads and its own small maneuvering engine. This bus follows a precise, computer-controlled path, and one by one it releases its warheads, adjusting its speed and heading between each release so that every warhead is thrown onto a slightly different course, toward a different city, a different missile field, a different bunker, hundreds of kilometers away from the others. Each warhead then falls back through the atmosphere on its own, glowing with the heat of re-entry, independent and unstoppable. A single launch blossoms, high above the Earth, into as many as 10 separate strikes, falling in 10 separate directions. The later versions surrounded those real warheads with as many as 40 decoys, lightweight dummies, and clouds of metallic chaff meant to swamp any radar trying to pick the genuine threats out of the swarm. Whatever missile defense the Americans might one day build, the Soviets intended to bury it under an avalanche of targets it could never sort in time. Getting all of this to function was not smooth, and honesty about the record matters. The engines suffered from dangerous vibrations, discovered only after the missiles were already in service, oscillations that spoiled accuracy and had to be painstakingly hunted down on test stands. Bureaucratic delays and engine problems meant, remarkably, that the missiles were placed on combat duty years before they were formally accepted by the military. The Soviets were fielding the deadliest weapon on the planet, while its own engineers were still chasing flaws inside it, a measure of just how badly the country wanted it standing ready. And the missile could do all of this because of a single, dominant quality: its throw weight, the raw mass it could hurl onto intercontinental targets. The throw weight of the SS-18 was about 8,800 kilograms. To put that in perspective, the heaviest missile the United States ever fielded, the Peacekeeper, could throw roughly 4,000 kilograms. The Soviet weapon could deliver more than twice the payload of the most powerful American missile. It was, and it remains, the heaviest intercontinental ballistic missile ever built by anyone. Nothing the United States ever deployed came close. By the end of the 1970s, tests suggested the missile's accuracy had improved to the point where its warheads were landing within about 180 meters of their aim points, at a range of 10,000 kilometers. A weapon that heavy, that many, and now that accurate, was no longer just a deterrent. In American eyes, it looked like a machine built to strike first. That accuracy did not come from the warheads, it came from the brain of the missile, its guidance system. Earlier rockets had leaned partly on signals sent from the ground, which could in theory be jammed or fed false commands. Yangel's school of design pushed instead toward full autonomy, a self-contained system that measured the missile's own motion from the instant of launch and corrected its own path with no help and no link to the outside world at all. There was nothing to jam, there was nothing to fool with a false signal. Once it flew, it steered itself, silently, by its own internal sense of where it was and where it had to go. As those systems grew more refined across each new generation, the circle in which a warhead was expected to land shrank from kilometers down to a few hundred meters. And shrinking that circle was exactly what turned a blunt instrument of terror into a precise silo killer, the very quality that set off the alarms in Washington. This is what the crews of the Soviet rocket force lived beside, day and night, for decades. Young officers in concrete capsules buried deep underground, reading, playing cards, waiting, with the keys to the most destructive machines ever built within arm's reach. They were, each of them, the human trigger on a weapon designed to end a civilization in an afternoon. And they served alongside its hidden menace. For all the strategic brilliance of storable fuel, never forget what those chemicals were. The fuel and oxidizer that let the missile wait for years in its silo were among the most poisonous and corrosive substances ever produced on an industrial scale. A serious leak in a sealed silo was a lethal event. The men who fueled, maintained, and guarded these missiles spent their careers a few feet of steel away from tanks of liquid that could kill quietly if a single seal failed. The Devil's Venom had earned its name on the pad in 1960, but it went on collecting a price for the next 30 years, in accidents and in the slow toll on the health of the people who tended the arsenal. Think about the psychological weight of that duty. Somewhere on the steppe, in a windowless capsule, two young officers spend a full day and night beside a console. If a certain order ever arrives, authenticated and confirmed, their task is to turn their keys and send 10 warheads toward 10 distant cities filled with people they will never see. They rehearse it until it becomes muscle memory. And the entire hope of the human race, on both sides of the ocean, rests on the order never actually coming. That was ordinary life at the sharp end of the balance of terror. Ordinary men maintaining an extraordinary machine, praying the signal they trained for would never be sent. Speed was its own kind of terror. A missile like this, launched from deep inside the Soviet Union, would cross the top of the world and arrive over North America in roughly 30 minutes. Its warheads fell the final stretch faster than sound, faster than any alarm could outrun. Once the order was given and the missile left its tube, no signal could call it back, and no switch could stop it. The whole chain of human judgment, the detection, the confirmation, the choice of whether to answer, had to happen inside that narrow half-hour, often in the dead of night, on incomplete information, with the lives of hundreds of millions of people resting on it. The machine had compressed the gravest decision a human being could ever make into a window shorter than a lunch break. But a weapon like this cannot stay hidden from the enemy forever, and when the West finally measured the full scale of what the Soviets had built, the reaction came close to panic. When American intelligence assembled the picture in the middle of the 1970s, the assessment inside the Pentagon was stark. This new Soviet capability had arrived, by some estimates, 4 or 5 years earlier than expected. Satellites saw the new silos going into the ground. Radars tracked the test flights. The number of warheads the Soviets could place on target was climbing far faster than any American war game had assumed. And it landed in the middle of an already fierce argument about whether American intelligence had been badly underestimating the Soviet threat all along. That argument produced a formal event. In 1976, the Central Intelligence Agency allowed an outside group of hawkish analysts, known simply as Team B, to review the raw data and write their own assessment as a deliberate challenge to the official one. Team B concluded that the Soviets were building not merely a deterrent, but a genuine war-fighting, first-strike arsenal, one designed to actually win a nuclear war by striking first and destroying America's ability to answer. Whether they were correct, or dangerously overstating the case, is still debated by historians today. But the weapon at the emotional core of their argument was the heavy Soviet missile, the one that could kill 10 targets at once and crack open hardened silos. It was around this period that the missile received its name in the NATO reporting system. Every Soviet surface-to-surface missile was assigned a number and a code name beginning with the same letter. This one, the 18th in the sequence, was given a word no cataloger chooses casually. Satan. The fear it generated reshaped American defense policy for a decade. The window of vulnerability became a rallying cry, invoked in presidential campaigns and congressional hearings and countless newspaper columns. The argument was seductive in its simplicity. If the Soviets could destroy America's land-based missiles in a surprise attack, then in a crisis an American president would face a terrible choice: use those missiles or lose them, launch on warning or watch them die in their silos. The weapon had, in theory, placed a gun against the head of American decision-making itself. It pushed the United States to design its own heavy missile in reply, the MX, later renamed the Peacekeeper, and then to tie itself in knots trying to figure out how to base it so that it could survive a Soviet surprise attack. The proposed basing schemes grew steadily more elaborate and more desperate. One plan called for a vast network of shelters linked by roads, among which the missiles would be shuffled endlessly like a shell game, so that the Soviets could never know which shelter held a real missile and which held a decoy. Another imagined the missiles racing between hardened sites on rails. Another proposed packing the silos so close together that incoming Soviet warheads would destroy one another in the attempt. None of these schemes was ever fully built. The United States spent years and fortunes searching for a way to protect its own missiles from one Soviet weapon, and never found an answer it could live with. One weapon system, conceived in a bureau in Ukraine, was now setting the defense budgets, the political campaigns, and the deepest anxieties of the most powerful nation on earth. And yet even this understates how far the Soviets had already gone, because years earlier, the same design bureau had asked a question so audacious it sounds like fiction. What if the missile did not fly toward its target at all? What if it flew the wrong way around the planet? To grasp why this mattered, you have to understand how the United States watched for an attack. American early warning radars were built to look north, over the Arctic, because that was the shortest path a Soviet missile would take to reach North America, straight across the pole. That radar fence, staring north, was the tripwire. It was the thing that would give American leaders their precious handful of minutes to get bombers airborne and order retaliation before the warheads struck. The entire warning system faced a single direction, because everyone knew which way the missiles would come. So the Soviets set out to make them come from the opposite direction. The concept was called a fractional orbital bombardment system. The idea, championed once again by Yangel's bureau and built on the giant frame of the SS-9, worked like this. Instead of arcing a warhead up and over on a predictable path, you launch it into a low orbit around the Earth. Once it is circling the planet, it can travel in any direction you please. You could send it south, down over Antarctica, and bring it up toward the United States from below, from the one direction where no radar was looking, where there was no warning and no tripwire. Then, before it completed even a single full orbit, you fire a braking rocket, drop it out of the sky, and it falls onto its target. Because it never finishes a whole orbit, only a fraction of one, it earned the word fractional. Khrushchev had boasted of exactly this power years before it existed, claiming that Soviet rockets could fly not only over the North Pole, but in the opposite direction, from angles where no warning stations could be placed, and that against such weapons the enemy's warning system had, in his words, lost its meaning. He was describing the ultimate surprise weapon, one that arrives with almost no warning at all. The idea was so attractive that all three great rival bureaus competed to build it. Korolev offered a design that never left the drawing board. Shelomey offered another, which was cancelled after his political patron Khrushchev was removed from power in 1964, a reminder that in the Soviet system, an engineer's fortunes rose and fell with his protectors. Only Yangel's design survived and reached deployment. There was, of course, a treaty in the way. In 1967, the Outer Space Treaty banned placing nuclear weapons in orbit. The Soviets threaded the needle with a lawyer's care. The weapon never completed a full orbit. So, they argued, it was never truly in orbit, and they conducted all their tests without live warheads to stay inside the letter of the agreement. The system was accepted into service in 1968. Within a few years, 18 of these orbital weapons stood ready in silos in Kazakhstan, the only nuclear weapons ever deployed that were designed to attack by way of space itself. One of the primary targets they were believed to be aimed at was the single American missile defense complex, the very site meant to shield the country, which a weapon coming up from the south could strike before anyone knew it was inbound. This is the point of no return in our story. The line that once crossed changed the character of the entire confrontation. Every earlier weapon, however terrible, still obeyed a certain logic. It flew a path you could see coming. It granted you minutes. It preserved, just barely, the possibility of warning and response, which is the thin thread that deterrence hangs from. The orbital bombardment weapon was a deliberate attempt to cut that thread, to build something that arrives before you even know it has been launched. It was the arms race reaching for the one thing that should never be reached for, a way to strike with no warning at all. What finally blunted it was not a counter-weapon, but a change in how the Americans watched the sky. The United States began deploying early warning satellites, spacecraft, that could detect the searing heat of a missile's engines from above, from space, the instant it lifted off, no matter which direction it was heading. Suddenly, the great advantage of the orbital weapon, its ability to sneak in from an unwatched angle, evaporated, because now the launch itself was seen the moment it happened. The system meant to erase all warning had been outflanked by a sensor looking down, rather than a radar looking sideways. The orbital missiles were eventually retired, limited by arms control, and made obsolete by the very race they had tried to leap ahead of. The main Satan force, though, only grew. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Soviets deployed these heavy missiles by the hundreds. At the peak, more than 300 of them stood in their silos, and because each could carry up to 10 warheads, that single weapon system accounted for something close to 3,000 nuclear warheads, a large share of the entire Soviet land-based force, concentrated in one design. The final and most refined version, given the Russian name Voyevoda, which means warlord, could carry its 10 warheads along with as many as 40 decoys, and it was hardened against the effects of nearby nuclear explosions so that it could ride out an attack and still launch. And here, the cold launch revealed its full menace. Because firing the missile did not destroy the silo, Soviet planners could contemplate something no hot-launched force could offer: a reload. A used silo could, in principle, be fitted with a fresh missile pulled from storage and fired a second time, turning each launch position from a single shot into a repeating weapon. Western analysts studying the force had to reckon not only with the missiles standing on alert, but with the reserve missiles that might follow them, a second wave rising from silos that should, by the old logic, have been spent. Now stand back and take in the whole of it at the height of the standoff. Across the vast interior of the Soviet Union, in the steppe and the forest, hundreds of hardened concrete shafts driven deep into the ground, each holding a fueled giant waiting in the dark. Thousands of warheads, aimed and programmed, needing only a short sequence of numbers to begin their fall. Mirror that with the American force pointed the other way, and you have the machinery of mutual destruction in its final, fully evolved form. Two civilizations each holding a loaded weapon to the other's head, and to its own, hour after hour, year after year, the entire arrangement resting on the fragile assumption that no one would ever be desperate enough or mistaken enough to fire. Both superpowers had now built themselves into a corner with no clean exit. Follow the logic of the weapon to its end. The SS-18 was so accurate, so heavily armed, and so numerous that it was ideal for one mission above all others: a first strike aimed at destroying the other side's missiles in their silos before they could launch. But a weapon perfectly suited to landing the opening blow is, for that very reason, deeply destabilizing, because it creates a horrible incentive. In a crisis, each side must fear that the other might be tempted to strike first, to use their silo-killing missiles before their own were caught on the ground. And if you fear the other side might go first, you feel pressure to consider going first yourself. simply to avoid being the one who waited. Instead of removing the danger, the weapon had manufactured a new kind of it, a hair trigger, where in a tense enough moment, the move that felt safest was the one that could end the world. How close that trigger truly sat became clear in 1983, one of the tensest years of the whole era. Relations between the two sides had soured badly. The rhetoric was harsh, trust had collapsed, and both arsenals stood at their peak. Late that year, NATO ran a large command exercise to rehearse the very procedures for authorizing a nuclear release. It was only a drill, but some in the Soviet leadership, primed by fear and half convinced that an American first strike might come disguised as a training exercise, reportedly began to wonder whether the rehearsal was cover for the real thing. For a short and frightening stretch, a misreading of an exercise, laid on top of arsenals like this one, brought the two sides nearer to disaster than most people alive at the time ever realized. It was a glimpse of the exact failure the whole balance was meant to prevent, a war begun not by intention but by misunderstanding, with weapons far too fast and too numerous to leave anyone time to think twice. There was no technological escape. You could not reliably defend against hundreds of warheads and thousands of decoys, and for all the money spent trying, such a defense did not exist and would not exist. You could not harden your silos enough, because no concrete could be made strong enough. You could not hide. Every purely military answer led straight back to the same place, building more of your own silo killers, which only deepened the instability and pulled the trigger tighter. The weapon had defeated strategy itself, so the answer, when it finally came, did not come from an engineer or a general. It came from a negotiating table, and this is the great reversal of the story. If you cannot beat the weapon with a better weapon, you beat it with a treaty. You strike at it not on any battlefield, but in its very right to exist, by persuading both sides to agree that this one uniquely dangerous machine is too destabilizing for anyone to be allowed to keep. That is very nearly what happened, and the detail of it is remarkable. When the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in the summer of 1991, they did something almost unheard of in the history of arms control. They singled out one specific weapon by category and set out to cut it in half and eventually strangle it. The heavy intercontinental missile, of which the Satan was the only example on Earth, was subjected to harsher rules than anything else in the agreement. The treaty ordered a 50% reduction in the force, the elimination of 154 of these missiles. It banned the development of any new type of heavy missile, so no direct successor could be built under its terms. It forbade quietly reducing their warhead counts to disguise their true power. It banned heavy missiles on mobile launchers and on submarines. The Soviets even signed a separate letter committing to eliminate 22 of these launchers every year for 7 years, a slow and methodical dismantling written into the fine print. Every one of these restrictions applied to a class of weapon that only one side possessed, because the United States had never built a heavy missile at all. The rules did not even apply to the Americans. There was nothing on their side to which they could apply. The treaty struck further still, at the exact quality that made the missile so dangerous, its throw weight. It capped the total throw weight each side could field, a limit that forced the Soviet arsenal down by roughly half, aimed squarely at the mass hurling capacity that had made the heavy missile such a nightmare. A follow-on agreement, negotiated soon after, tried to finish the work by banning multiple warhead land-based missiles altogether, which would have meant the outright extinction of the Satan as a species of weapon. The intent could not have been clearer. The most powerful machine ever built was not to be matched. It was to be legislated out of existence. There was one more feature of the agreement that had never truly existed before, and it changed the very texture of the rivalry. To make the reductions real, rather than merely promised, both sides agreed to open their most secret places to the other. American officials would stand inside Soviet missile fields. Soviet officials would walk American bases in return. Men who had spent entire careers preparing to annihilate one another now watched, in person, as missiles were drawn up out of their silos, and as launch tubes were filled with rubble or torn apart. The weapon that had been the object of such dread became, in its final years, something to be counted, catalogued, and dismantled under the watching eyes of the enemy. There are few stranger images in the whole history of the Cold War than an American inspector standing on the open step, notebook in hand, calmly recording the destruction of a Satan. For a moment, it looked like the end. The treaty was signed. The Cold War was winding down. Along the borders of a crumbling Soviet Union, the great confrontation was easing, and the machinery of the apocalypse was being switched off, silo by silo. Inspectors would come. Missiles would be pulled from the ground. The Berlin Wall had already fallen in 1989, and the world was beginning to exhale. Surely the age of the city killers was passing, and then the Soviet Union did something no treaty had planned for. It ceased to exist. Here is the twist that reopens everything, and it arrives from a direction almost no one had been watching. When the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991, its territory shattered into 15 independent countries. The missiles, the design bureaus, and the factories did not politely relocate to the new, smaller Russia. They stayed where they had been placed. Remember where Yangel had built his bureau, and why. Far from Moscow, deliberately, in Ukraine, in the city of Dnipropetrovsk. The Yuzhnoye Design Bureau that had conceived the Satan, and the enormous factory that had assembled every single one of them, were now inside the borders of a newly independent Ukraine. The position Russia suddenly found itself in was almost without precedent. The most powerful weapon in its arsenal, the backbone of its land-based deterrent, the machine that had held the United States at bay for 2 decades, had been designed and built by an organization that now stood on the sovereign soil of another nation. The engineers who understood the missile best, the plant that could service and replace it, the industrial knowledge gathered over 30 years, all of it now belonged to a different country. Russia possessed the missiles, but no longer possessed the means to make them. The human details are almost too neat to believe. The man who had run the great factory where every Satan was assembled, Leonid Kuchma, went on to become the president of independent Ukraine. Vladimir Utkin, Yangel's successor and the designer who had brought the weapon to life, eventually left the now Ukrainian bureau and returned to Russia to continue his work there, a man following his nation across a border that had appeared, overnight, straight through the middle of his life's labor. And some of the deployed missiles sat in yet another new country, Kazakhstan, which suddenly held a share of the world's most powerful weapons and had to be persuaded, through years of patient diplomacy, to give them up. The collapse of the Soviet Union had scattered the pieces of Armageddon across 3 sovereign nations. The unwinding was slow and messy. The follow-on treaty that was meant to ban the multiple warhead land missiles became mired in politics on both sides and never fully entered into force. So the missiles did not vanish. They aged. Weapons built in the 1980s stayed in their silos into the 2000s and beyond, maintained, extended, and kept on alert far past the lifespan their designers had imagined, because Russia had no easy way to replace them. The most modern versions of the Voyevoda remained the anchor of the Russian land-based force deep into the 21st century, weapons of a vanished empire standing guard for the state that had inherited them and could not, at first, build anything to take their place. Which brings us to the last confrontation in this story, and it is not a clash between 2 armies. It is Russia against the ghost of its own creation. Eventually, the original missiles truly did begin to reach the end of their lives. Metal fatigues, propellants degrade. Even the finest machine cannot stand forever in a hole in the ground. Russia needed a successor, a new heavy missile to carry the legacy onward. But the bureau that had built the Satan was now Ukrainian, and by the 2000s relations between the 2 countries were sliding toward open hostility. Russia would have to build its Satan again, from the beginning, without the people who had known it best. The task fell to a different bureau inside Russia, the Makiev Center, which began work on a homegrown replacement, something Russia had never had to attempt before because Ukraine had always done it. Their answer was a new heavy missile, and the world, with grim inevitability, handed it the name that was waiting: Satan II. On paper, it is a worthy heir, a giant of over 200 tons and some 35 meters long, with a claimed range long enough to strike by flying the long way around the globe, over either pole, reviving the old dream of an attack from an unwatched direction. Russian officials boast that it can carry 10 or more warheads, or a payload of hypersonic gliding weapons that streak through the atmosphere at many times the speed of sound and are meant to slip past any defense. Moscow has marketed it relentlessly as unstoppable, the crown jewel of a new generation of arms, unveiled with great fanfare. The logic behind reviving such a monster is not hard to read. In the decades since the Cold War, the United States has fielded limited defenses against ballistic missiles, systems built to catch a small number of incoming warheads. A weapon that can carry many warheads at once, screen them with clouds of decoys, and arrive by an unpredictable route is designed to make any such defense meaningless through sheer overwhelming force. In other words, the newest giant answers a 21st century problem with a distinctly 20th century philosophy, the same one Yangel's bureau embraced long ago. Do not try to be subtle. Be too large, too many, and too fast to stop. The boasts and the reality, though, have drifted sharply apart. Russia first promised the weapon would be ready around 2018. That date slipped, and then slipped again. The program was dogged by trouble from its earliest ejection tests, which revealed problems with the launch system, the very cold launch technology that Yangel's engineers had mastered decades earlier, now proving stubborn for their successors. There was one clearly successful full-range test flight in April of 2022. On the strength of that single success, a Russian official announced the weapon had entered combat duty, though notably the announcement did not come from the country's president. Then the failures came into public view. In September of 2024, a test at a northern launch site ended in disaster. Satellite images taken afterward showed a fresh crater roughly 60 meters across where the silo had stood, ringed by scorched ground. The missile had, in all likelihood, exploded at or near the moment of launch. Another attempt, reported the following year, showed a missile veering off course, losing thrust, and falling back toward the Earth near the pad. Sit with that image, and then set it beside where we began. In October of 1960, Mikhail Yangel stepped away from a fully fueled rocket to smoke a cigarette, and moments later, that rocket became a fireball that killed a marshal and dozens of men and burned a scar into the Kazakh steppe. More than 60 years later, the newest attempt to rebuild his most fearsome creation was tearing itself apart in fire on a launch pad in northern Russia, blasting a crater into the frozen ground. The devil's venom, it seems, still demands its price. The weapon born in fire keeps returning to it. So what does all of it amount to? This 30-year pursuit of the ultimate weapon. Weigh the ledger with clear eyes. As pure engineering, the Satan was a triumph without equal. By every technical measure, Yangel's bureau achieved something no other nation ever matched, and the heaviest intercontinental missile ever built remains a Soviet design to this day. Yet look at what all that power actually purchased. Historians still argue over whether the whole enterprise was even rational. The Soviet Union poured an incalculable share of its wealth, the talent of its finest engineers, and the output of entire cities into building and maintaining these missiles. And the strategic gain is genuinely hard to measure, because the weapon's only purpose was to be feared, never used. It bought deterrence, yes, but it also bought instability, an arms race that dragged both nations to the edge of ruin, and a target painted so brightly on the Soviet arsenal that it shaped a decade of American hostility and an entire treaty regime built to disarm it. There is a serious case that the heavy missile, by being too good at threatening a first strike, left the Soviet Union less secure than a more modest force would have. The pursuit of an unbeatable weapon may have been not only terrifying, but quietly self-defeating. And there is a final turn worth naming, because it is the deepest irony of all. The very extremity of this weapon may be what finally forced the two sides to the table. It is easy to ignore small, ambiguous threats. It was impossible to ignore a machine that could kill 10 cities from a single silo. The Satan was so grotesquely, so undeniably dangerous that it concentrated the minds of leaders on both sides and gave them a reason to negotiate the most far-reaching arms control agreements ever written, agreements shaped, clause by clause, around the outline of this one weapon. In that strange sense, the devil helped write its own sentence. The machine that embodied the madness of the arms race also became the clearest argument for why that race had to end. The missiles that survive are old now, tended by a country still struggling to replace them. Their intended heir keeps failing in fire on its launch pads, and the man who set all of it in motion, the engineer from a poor Siberian village who walked away from one inferno and spent his life building larger ones, lies buried in Moscow. His name, oddly, did not fade with the empire he armed. There is a street named for Yangel in the capital and a station on the Underground Railway, and far beyond any of it, there is a crater on the moon that carries his name, and a small asteroid, drifting through the dark between the planets that carries it too. It is a fitting last resting place for the memory of the man who built Satan. His weapon was meant to fall from the sky onto cities full of people, and never once did. His name, instead, rose all the way to the stars, and stayed there, silent, looking down.